I don't have any questions. I just want to say that was an amazing presentation, and maybe you would consider submitting it for an op-ed or something. It really needs to be out there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was tremendous. My name is Sampe Lalungpa. I'm also in international development, like you, for many years. I think with the billionaire thing, you've raised a really interesting. So if the billionaires, the existence of this pool of people with this tremendous capital, I think there's an opportunity there. We should pick their pockets before we, go on to other more structural responses. And what I mean by that is, over the years, I've seen the work of the Gates Foundation, and in conjunction with Warren Buffett and some like-mindeds, they're putting $20 to $30 billion into healthcare and reviving things like malaria control, which never got any traction because no company could make money from malaria because it's mostly a poor people's disease. We should throw Mr. Gates a challenge. Please raise $200 billion to take forward the climate agenda. I'm sure he can do it. And in the meantime, we bring other structural changes. But let's pick their pockets and bring them into the circle of virtue too, as a pragmatic response. What do you think of that?
Just that, that whole billionaires contributing, Gates, I love Gates. I love that he said that billionaires should be giving their money. But he and Nick Hanover, who's another billionaire, have made it clear that I don't want their charity. I want justice. They shouldn't have that much money. They need to be taxed. That money should be going to government. It shouldn't be up to Bill Gates to decide where money gets spent, where that kind of money gets spent. It should be spent by governments who are listening to their people and deciding where that money goes. It shouldn't be a bunch of what's that word? Oligarchs who are making decisions about public policy. No.
It's just a transitional thing.
No. Tax them.
Hi, my name is Sylvie Lemieux. I'm on the board of director for the Group of 78. I call myself an eclectic activist because I seem to be in a lot of fields. And right now, I certainly have a lot of anger, and I feel like pretty much hopeless. I raised my own Greta, so my daughter has been punching my chest for a while, telling me since she was about 8 years old that I wasn't doing enough for the world. So try to live with that. She's now 25. I was twice a Green Party candidate, thinking if I cannot work from inside government to affect changes, maybe I can, go into politics and affect changes. Well, you see what the Greens are today. Obviously, got 3% my first election and 2.8% my second election. Everybody told me I was the one that had the most information, know my files, knew where all the money was going, but they couldn't vote for me because, the Greens. So I tried that didn't work. So I decided to go back to school, so I have a master and a doctorate now. And I won, I applied to a global competition that was raised by a billionaire. He put $7 million on something called the Global Challenge Foundation. So I got myself a semi-finalist, went to Stockholm, was there with 200 people, how are we gonna change global governance, and 200 people for 4 days, basically hug each other, but the foundation is moving forward. I just want to leave you with something I learned just before, I go to World Social Forums. So I participate in a lot of them, and everything we talk about is there, but it's 40,000 people or 70,000 people talking about the same issues in a very chaotic way. And we hug ourselves a lot and do a lot of network and talk about outer globalism and things like that. I was told by an economist professor in Montreal that if you have $3,000 in the bank, you're part of the 1%. Think about that.
I think 10, but
yeah. That was in 2013 before going to Tunisia, after revolution for the World Social Forum to stop them from having a civil war. So at the end of the day, when you look at the possibility, and as a Canadian, where do you invest yourself to make a difference? I'm part of this advocacy group. We send letters, you know. So I meditate a lot these days. I try to do positive things, family, you know. I heard Madame Polanyi a few years ago with community garden, you know, staying hopeful, you know, do things at the local level. But I am mad at the global level, you know. So I was quite interested in a conversation yesterday. My question is that I don't know, I seem to be running out of ideas to really make a difference. So any comments on that?
An amazing speech. I've certainly felt the anger, the fear, and I didn't actually feel that much hope, but maybe there was a little in there. And I'm a great fan of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I am all the time looking for accelerator actions that could actually get us to move along those. But my main question is how to get your anger, fear, and hope out into the world. And my hope is that we actually have a lot more tools than we did 10 or 15 years ago. We have, particularly in this country, a lot of educated millennials. We haven't got into digital voting, which would be one way to empower them. I'm also very impressed by Bloomberg. He may be just giving peanuts, but he has been giving millions of dollars to organizations to actually change policy successfully in the United States on guns and on other issues. I'm also very impressed by March for Our Lives. We've actually seen quite significant changes, and I think we'll see much more. But I'd love to know your vision as to how to get your message out so that people actually feel the anger, fear, and hope and actually act on what you've been talking about.
You mentioned that civil society is essential and that we need to have open and informed debate. My estimate is that in Canada today, less than 30% of the electorate are interested in or involved in open and informal debate. The solution, in my view, is to switch a democratic system, so-called, which is really an oligarchic system, to one of direct deliberative democracy on the part of all of our citizens, who should be willing to spend at least 1 hour every day in the process of becoming informed for the purpose of open and informal debate. I don't know what you think about that.
Julie, I'm amazed that you haven't mentioned something very crucial about the representational quality of our governments. We are still living with first past the post. As you know, that was a broken promise under Trudeau. A lot of us are very concerned, and we're working with Fair Vote Canada, which is very much concerned with the fact that 77% of the people that were consulted under a questionnaire were for proportional representation, and yet we still don't have it. It's a long way away. We only have, 13% of our parliament that's women, and other places that have it, it's up to the late 30s, high 30s. We are the only three, with United States and Britain, and goodness knows they're having their problems now, who are not having proportional representation. There are 85 countries that are in the OECD, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. Apropos of debate, they are now getting ready for a special national, what's this called now? National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. If you all want to hear about it, please look at their website at fairvote.ca and get involved. It's more than important at this day and age. You've got to have representatives in your government to get the women's issues, minorities issues, and all that across. When you've got two parties, they're just not representative of the rest of our population.
While you're finding the next person, I'll try to say a few things, though again, all of you are sort of answering your own questions, so I don't really need to say much about it. On representation, I completely agree. You guys are the best advocates on earth for this. The people who have been with the Fair Vote group, you're doing an amazing job, and sadly, you know, that thing, broken promises, that's a thing, so we have to fight it again in the next election, I hope. Sustainable development goals, I love the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think what I loved the most about them was that it was a political act to say that all of these things are interconnected, that to do just one isn't enough. And so to me, what is brilliant about the SDGs is their wholeness, and that was, I think, what was being said by the Southern leaders when they agreed to it, was the recognition of that wholeness of all of those. It's not about the 117 indicators or whatever. It's about the fact that all of those things, it's interconnected, and all those things need to be addressed at one time. And then in terms of how it was a couple of questions that were kind of generally around how to get the message out. And I think this is the thing that I love the most about Oxfam, is that it comes from a long history of solidarity movements, former EDs here in this room who pushed those issues back in the day, and I think that continues to be the case, and that continues to be what gives me great hope for the future. And I think working on, you know, we work with youth movements and women's rights organizations and labor movements around the world. We're part of a very large group called the Fight Inequality Alliance that's mobilizing, that's getting leaders on board. So that's the sort of thing that gives me hope, is that kind of movement building and solidarity movement building in this on the issue of inequality and climate justice as well. Question? Keep going.
There we go. Thanks, Julie. You inspire me, but I want your praise. And
I love you, Lou.
And I'm trying to decide who to vote for. And I'm having
I am
having a great deal of difficulty, and I would like you to be proud of me. Tell me.
I work for a charitable organization, and the charity law still requires me to be nonpartisan, which I am. But I'll tell you later.
Well, another idea might be a world wealth tax developed within the United Nations framework and the Bretton Woods institutions, but perhaps administered at the national level to support the Sustainable Development Goals. If it was all done at once in a collective way, it might overcome the political constraints that exist at the national level.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is something that Oxfam's been working very hard on, is the global regulatory systems at the global level. And obviously, this is the problem. You can't address taxation only at a national level wholly because of the way globalization works. So that there's lots of information on the Oxfam website around the global tax system and how that's the only way actually to deal with wealth, extreme wealth in particular.
Yes, I'm Lawrence Cumming, and shortly before the writ was dropped for this election, the Canada Revenue Agency proclaimed that charitable organizations wanting to participate in a meaningful way in the election would have to register as third parties. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the effect of that pronouncement. And secondly, if you could reflect on the sector in which you're involved, the organized part of civil society that's concerned with international development, disarmament, peace, the environment, social justice, etc. How well they're rising to the occasion or not?
I'll comment quickly on the third-party registration. I mean, I do think it's been a bit of a, a suppression on free speech of charitable organizations that have, I think, a public policy role in public debate. And for Oxfam Canada, we did make a decision to register as a third party. It's not that hard, but for a smaller organization, I think it would be a bit challenging. It requires a separate bank account. It requires all even salaries going through this bank account. It requires anything over $500 being spent on advertising. And that could be not only that is partisan, because obviously we can't do anything partisan, but if let's say we believe in a carbon tax, if any of the parties identify at all with a carbon tax, that's seen as being partisan or election. So we decided that just not only to be on the safe side, because we don't want to have a problem later, but also actually to send a message that it is important for charitable organizations like ours to be having a voice during an election period. I'm pretty sure we're the only organization, the only large international organization in Canada, international NGO, that did get third-party status. I'll be surprised if there are many others. But yeah, I think it has suppressed to some extent. On the other hand, we thought it was important to demonstrate that we are doing it, that we are speaking publicly during the election. We do have quite a lot of election-related materials. Unfortunately, in the meantime, Facebook doesn't allow us to promote any of our content. So even the election, we did do an election, and I invite you all to look at it, sort of an election primer, what to ask your MPs on a variety of progressive issues that we've been following since the last 4 years or so. That's part of our feminist scorecard that we put out every year. And even that, we can't promote it, even though obviously it's nonpartisan, but it's impossible to promote. So I think that's as much of an answer as I can give. On the other one, commenting on the sector as a whole, on inequality, I don't think that there's been, I don't know which sector you'd be thinking about. I mean, if I'm thinking about the international NGO sector, I don't think that enough of the international NGOs ever talk broadly about the system or about the kinds of reasons why we have inequality. They talk more about poverty in its very, very simplistic kind of view, and a much more charity model in many ways. So I think that they're avoiding what they all know to be true. We know all the people who work in all the different organizations, and they share many of our progressive ideas, but they're less willing to come out and fight or say those things. Sorry.
My name is Earl Turcott. I'm with the Group of 78, the Canadian Pugwash Group, and also with the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. You spoke of anger, fear, and hope in relation, of course, to inequality and poverty, and also with respect to climate change, an existential threat. And there are obvious links, of course, between that and the existential threat of nuclear Armageddon. Just a short infomercial, or a plea rather, to this group here, many of whom are involved in all of these, in the fight, in all of these challenges, but that if we see global mobilization on climate change, please, at every opportunity, raise the issue of nuclear disarmament, because they do go hand in hand, and we certainly won't be able to make any inroads on poverty or reduction in poverty and equality if there is no world left. So, thank you.
Thank you, Earl. I work also, and Oxfam works quite closely with the Women, Peace and Security movement in Canada and around the world, and that is definitely a call that the Women, Peace and Security movement is making, is an end to arms. And also the Arms Trade Treaty, which we have made some significant inroads on recently, as you know.
I have one comment on civil society activism, and I'd like to get your response. About a decade ago, I chaired a committee that looked at civil society organizations, voluntary organizations. We had a former senior civil servant, we had a former banker, and a senior participant in civil society organization. And we recommended that all charitable organizations should have the right, an unequivocal right, to do as much advocacy as they wanted, as long as they clearly stated that was their objective. So if you're an anti-poverty group and 100% of your revenue is going to advocacy, you have to state it. And then anyone who wants to contribute would know that that's happening. Now, I think, frankly, it got nowhere. I talked to senior government people at the time, and I think it doesn't matter at least which of the other two parties are in power, it won't happen, because it would really, in my view, provide a much more vibrant civil society overall if charitable organizations were free to participate in debate. It would make a very rich civil society in terms of active democracy. And I think it's a good idea, and I'd be interested in your idea.
Well, I think we actually kind of won that fight lately. You know, there was the cap on advocacy was 10%. And thanks in large part to Leilani, who you saw earlier, who's as the executive director of Canada Without Poverty, and a number of other NGOs, ourselves included, we fought that law quite hard, and ultimately, and they took it to the courts and won. There was a brief period where we were afraid that it might get appealed, but we no longer have a cap on the amount of advocacy that we can do, as long as it's in line with our charitable purposes. So in our case, our charitable purposes are related to poverty. I won't go into our charitable purposes, but they're related to poverty, and our argument is that inequality is the root cause of poverty, and therefore we campaign women's rights, root cause of poverty, and therefore we campaign publicly on those issues. And now we no longer have any cap on how much we can do that, which is, as I was saying to somebody earlier, advocacy is actually quite cheap in the greater scheme of things, and because we have so much programming, we're rarely falling, you know, above that 10% anyway. But under the Harper era, there was also a call that any of our overseas programming couldn't be advocacy related either, and now the bulk of our overseas programming is. So if it's on sexual and reproductive health and rights, a huge part of that is supporting women's rights organizations to advocate on behalf of those issues in their countries. So we would have run afoul of those laws pretty quickly if they'd started looking at our overseas programming as well. So I think now, yay Leilani and others, we are in pretty good shape until there's a new government, and we'll see what happens. But I mean, it was actually it was the Supreme Court that decided that we have, or the appeals court that decided that we have that right. So in order for them to overturn it, it would be pretty serious.
Hi, Julie. Over here. Martin Settle. I want to, first off, just thank you for calling attention to the abdication of decision-making about public good to billionaire-controlled foundations. I think that is a problem in our democratic dialogue. And a lot of our conversations have focused on how do we motivate people in the election, but I think a lot of the policy decision-making is now being done not through the electoral process, but through other bureaucratic policy making. And often we hear about multi-stakeholder partnerships that are involved in those decision making. I'm wondering if you can comment or suggest, how do we confront the fallacy that the interests of people whose lives are at stake is equivalent to the people whose profit is at stake?
Peggy Mason from the Group of 78 and the Rideau Institute. I actually wanted to come back to the discussion about partisan and so on, because reference is constantly made in this problem to the Canada Revenue Agency, but as you pointed out, of course, the Supreme Court decision and the government agreeing to follow it has solved that problem. The real problem is the Elections Act. And that there is a section we are told that this was an amendment that obviously none of us saw somewhere along the line, which makes it partisan to make a statement on anything where the party has an issue. I mean, it's an absurdity, it's a complete suppression of free speech, but it looks like, during the election, the government was very nervous. They're not going to criticize anything under that act, and you can understand why. But it clearly has to be amended, and if it isn't amended, I cannot see how it can possibly stand, a court challenge. So I think it's important for people to realize that it's a section of the Elections Act that purports to try and put these limits on free speech. And while I'm up here, I just have to recall, because of this wonderful discussion about wealth and inequality, I just want to recall a Danish proverb, which is, "Happy are we if few have too little, and fewer still too much." That's an old proverb, but it speaks to the balance that you need for democracy to function. And I think it's wonderful that we've had so much discussion of that very point. Thank you.
Thank you. Reminds me of the other quote that is, if you want to live the American dream, move to Denmark. Marty, I have no answer for you. That is it is the absurdity that 3.8 billion people seem to be worth less than 2,700. It's the insanity that, that Greta is standing up and saying, you people are insane. Something has to change here.
I just wanted to find out how entrepreneurship is being used around the world to be able to decrease the inequality in societies. If you could speak to that, either for women or for the people who are making only $4 a day. How are people having access to good quality jobs or creating wealth for themselves and actually being able to capture it, not just having it getting sucked away from their society? So how is entrepreneurship being increasing or decreasing the inequality in the world?
It's a good question. There are many people who would argue with me about this one, but I feel like there is an overemphasis on the idea of entrepreneurship, particularly for women. Yes. And we all think that somehow microcredit is going to be the magic bullet that's going to save all the women in the world, but every woman cannot be an entrepreneur. And that kind of idea around entrepreneurship for poor women, it really does support the entrepreneurial poor, which is a very different category than the extreme poor, or what I call the crazy poor. They don't have enough assets usually to have the kind of, and I'm talking about other kinds of assets besides money and so on. So I just don't think entrepreneurship is a solution for what is ailing us. It's not that I'd love it if people are entrepreneurial and do things and create things and raise money and so on. I just don't think it's the answer to poverty isn't going to be entrepreneurship. It's one thing.
But isn't the fundamental of entrepreneurship solving problems for others?
Yeah, so I think I'm entrepreneurial. As the head of Oxfam Canada, I'm very entrepreneurial, and I do entrepreneurial things that support, but it's not about raising profit. I guess that's the difference. Being entrepreneurial and profit making are different. But yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time, and so I just wanted to add to what had already been said by John Foster from Kingston. Is he still with us? He left yesterday, and Earl Turcotte a little bit earlier, about expenditures on arms. Because beyond the insanity of nuclear weapons, we also spend a whole lot on arms and armaments. You think about, even if we never use them, the US has this plan to modernize its nuclear arsenal at a cost of $1 trillion over the next decade or so. If you look at the CF-35 purchase that the Canadian government is contemplating, another couple of billion, I don't know what the exact figure is, but it goes on. So in addition to the wealth of the multi-zillionaires, there's a lot of wealth squandered by our governments on armaments that can easily and should usefully be redeployed to the social sector and to redress inequality. So that's something that I don't think anyone has quite addressed in this room as yet. So I wanted to add that and then end by thanking you for your passion, for your inspiration, and and for giving us some good ideas. So thank you, Julie.